Hello, Aaron Kubitz, personal trainer at Functional Aesthetics EC. We're helping average guys perform better in their lives inside and outside the gym. In today's video, I'm going to be covering a three-pronged approach to helping you to relieve hip flexor discomfort, pain, tightness in your hip flexors, something that is becoming more and more common as people are moving more away from manual labor jobs, which actually they've been doing for at least the past 2 decades or so, and moving more and more towards work on their computers, remote work, things like that. And what happens when you're sitting most of the time, and I made a video on this a couple years ago, but I'm going to add a couple things into this video, is that when you're sitting most of the time, you're basically in an unnatural position. Your hip flexors are most of the time supposed to be either lengthened out and then alternating between lengthening out and going like that, right? So extension, flexion, as you are walking around, running, jumping, whatever you would be naturally doing in nature. It's unnatural to be sitting for 6, 7, 8 hours or more of your day, as so many of us do. Many of us sit all day at the office, then we're too wiped out, we get home, we sit more when we get home, and it just kind of exacerbates that. So what happens is you get these tight hip flexors, and then the opposite side of that, the thing that counteracts the hip flexors is your glutes, right? So your glutes are extending the hip out, also externally rotating it, but they can't do that because you're sitting on them. So oftentimes people's glute muscles are what we call switched off, or they have amnesia, and they've forgotten how to actually fire properly. So even if you go to the gym and you try to do an exercise like a barbell hip thruster, which I'll be showing later in the video, you might not actually be getting the optimal benefits from that exercise because your muscles have lost the ability to fire properly, and instead you're using more quadriceps and hamstrings to do the exercise, because those muscles are not activating properly. So in this video, I'm going to go over a three-pronged approach on how you can help to relieve that tight hip flexor issue for good. Now, the first thing that people often think about when they think about I have tight hip flexors is I need to stretch out my hip flexors. And while that might be true, just because a muscle is tight does not necessarily mean that the only thing that you need to do for it is to stretch it. Oftentimes the muscle is tight as a protective mechanism because it's too weak. If there's instability in an area of the body, the muscles surrounding that instability will tighten up to add more stability to it. And so the same thing happens with the hip flexors. Oftentimes you have a tight hip flexor and the hip flexor is also weak at the same time. So yes, you do need to stretch out your hip flexor, but in addition to stretching out your hip flexor, you also need to strengthen the hip flexor to prevent that same problem from coming back in the future. And so I'm going to show you this three-pronged approach, how to do that, and then also strengthening the muscles on the opposite side of the joint that oppose the muscle that is tight to help reestablish that alignment and make sure that it stays loose and doesn't get tight. So one other thing that I want to point out before we get into the stretching component of this, because many of you have probably already seen a hip flexor stretch, even though you may or may not necessarily be doing the stretch properly. Another thing is that there is another muscle that may actually be tight instead of the hip flexor, so you want to address both of these, because oftentimes when you go to the gym and you start working out, you end up tightening up this muscle and then you think your hip flexor is tight when in fact it is actually this other muscle. So what you want to do first is you want to help loosen up the muscles that you want to stretch first. So I have to put this here at a slight angle to kind of fit the groove for the hip flexor is there. And then you just roll a little bit here to help loosen that up and loosen that area up. To now make it more receptive to the stretch that you're going to do. So now with the stretch, what you want to do for your stretch is you want to start off in this lunge position, right? And I like to start off in an exaggerated position before I often do a lot of my stretches in order to really make sure you're working the entire range of motion. So you're going to start off in this lunge position, you're going to rise up on the ball of the back foot, and then you're going to lean forward, push your hips forward at the same time you're dropping your knee down towards the ground. If you're doing this properly, you're going to feel a really deep stretch all the way down the front of the quads in the hip flexor here. Now, if that's not too intense for you and you want to increase the stretch, the next thing you want to do is you want to push your hips forward now without leaning yourself forward or arching your lower back. Because if you remember, the muscle that opposes the action of the hip flexor is the glute muscle. So if you contract your glute muscle, tighten it up, and use that to push yourself forward, you're going to actually be using a contract-relax technique, or reciprocal inhibition, which basically means that when you contract a muscle on one side of a joint, it automatically makes the muscle on the other side of the joint relax. So reciprocal inhibition, you're going to contract that glute muscle, and that's going to help your hip flexor muscle to relax. And you also want to make sure that you're breathing in prior to the stretch, exhale into the stretch, hold, and then continue breathing in and out, full deep breaths, and that will again help to activate your parasympathetic nervous system, which will allow the muscle that you're stretching to relax. Okay, so now what is that other muscle that I'm talking about that may actually be the culprit for your tight hip flexors instead of the hip flexors? Well, the other muscle I'm talking about, and you may have already guessed it because it lies in the same plane as that hip flexor muscle, is your quadriceps muscle. So the quadriceps muscle actually comes up and it all attaches all the way up here on your anterior superior iliac spine, and then at various different points in the knee, because there's 4 different muscle heads. So various different points around here it's going to attach. Now, if you are, and there is an actual physical therapy test that you could do where you land on a bench and stuff, and to tell whether or not it's your quads or your hip flexors that are stressed, now, or that are the tight muscle. I'm not going to go over that in this particular video today because I want to keep it brief. But if you want to look that up, there are some videos there. I think Jeff Cavalier may or may not have one of those videos, but there are also some physical therapy videos on YouTube that you can look at to assess whether or not it is your quadriceps or your hip flexors. Now, so it would be a good idea to make sure that you're stretching both of those. Obviously, you have your standard quadricep stretch like this, and again, you can contract that muscle at the same time, or contract your glutes and your hamstrings at the same time to help increase the stretch on your quadriceps. Another good exercise that I like to do, which is a combination of a quadriceps stretch and strengthening at the same time, and also stretching out your hip flexors, is basically a Nordic stretch. So you're going to go back like this, hands at your chest, breathe, deep breath in, and you just go to that point where it feels like, okay, I got enough tension, I got a pretty good stretch, and then come back up. Over time, you can get farther and farther down where you may actually be getting close enough where you're, depending on the bulk of your hamstrings and your glutes, where you're almost hitting your head on the ground and then coming back up. So this is actually a really great illustration of the concept of mobility, which I often talk about in my videos. So stretching is just to have the range of motion to get into a into a position, whereas mobility is the flexibility to get into that move position, and then also the strength to get out of that position as well without help from other muscles like your arms or other things like that. So if, for example, you go in to do a side splits and then you could pull yourself back out of that, or a front splits, pull yourself back out of that, various different things like that. So it's important beyond just flexibility to also have mobility, and oftentimes if you train mobility, you don't need to train flexibility as much because they work at the same level, and it will also make you less likely to injure yourself above and beyond just stretching, which might make you flexible, but can actually increase risk of injury if you don't also have the mobility or the full range of motion strength to go along with it. Alright, so now we get into the fun part of the video, which is the strengthening aspect. And the first exercise that I'm going to show you is a glute activation exercise called a duck stand, which at the same time also helps to stretch your hip flexors out. So what you want to do is you're going to stand, again, with your feet, kind of like have that duck walk with the feet abducted out to the side. And then what you're going to do is you're going to, in this position, relax the hips, and starting in an anterior pelvic tilt with the knees slightly bent, you're then going to lock the knees out at the same time where you posteriorly rotate the pelvis and contract your glute muscles, while at the same time bringing the pelvis up in the front and your rib cage down towards your belly button. So how that look in real time is deep breath in, and you're going to just lock it out, knees completely locked out, butt squeezed together. Hold that for 30 seconds to a minute, and do that 1 to 3 rounds. Alright, so a slightly more advanced exercise after you've gotten the hang of the duck stand and you've activated would be to move into actual just hip bridge exercise. So again, with the feet toes slightly pointed out, heels roughly shoulder width apart, deep breath in, extend the hips up. This is also great for stretching out your shoulders as well, which tend to become tight when you're doing a lot of sitting and working in front of you. And then if you go to the gym, you're doing bench presses, overhead presses, and stuff like that. So again, ribs pushed down, hips pushed up, and you should feel a good squeeze there. Hold that for 30 seconds to a minute. Repeat 3 times. Another great glute strengthening exercise, in addition to being a great conditioning exercise as well, popularized by the Russian strength and conditioning coach Pavel Statstelin, is a kettlebell swing. A kettlebell swing is slightly different than the barbell hip thruster. Barbell hip thruster is more of a strength exercise, whereas the kettlebell swing, yes, you're going to get some strength benefits because it is a weight, but because it's a smaller weight and you're moving it a little bit faster, it's going to be developing a little bit more of power and endurance, but still working the glutes. And as any of you who have watched my channel know before, I'm a big fan of hybrid training. So meaning training all the different energy systems while having maybe a primary focus on a particular one that is relative to your sport or your particular fitness objectives at that time. So even if you're a power lifter, you may still want to be doing some running or some, Olympic lifting or something like that mixed in there a little bit into your routine, as well as maybe some bodybuilding. If you're a bodybuilder, from time to time you might want to include some really heavy lifts like a power lifter. And if you're an endurance athlete, you might actually want to be doing some heavy squats every once in a while to help, increase your leg strength. So the kettlebell swing, the key thing that you want to remember is that it's not an arm exercise. Your arms are just holding the weight. You want to use enough weight so that your arms can't fly up, above shoulder height. Ideally, you can even basically just keep them elbows slightly bent and just keep it right at your sides like that. So, because it's all supposed to be a hip exercise, thus the glutes, because one of the functions of the glutes is to extend the hip, right? So if you're trying to work your glutes, you want to make sure you're extending the hips, right? And at the same time, it's also dynamically stretching your hip flexors at the same time, which is why oftentimes you don't want to just be focusing on just stretching or just massage work or anything like that. Oftentimes it can be good when you're just getting into something, but as you'll find, many times people who are already very active and fit won't need as much stretching and foam rolling and things like that as somebody who's a little bit more sedentary, because the body is designed to be moving, and the more that you're moving it, the more supple and limber it is going to be, provided you're moving it in a proper way. So with the kettlebell swing, what you want to be doing is extend the hips. I like to slightly toe the feet out, because then I get even more engagement, and have a slight bend in the knees as you're going back. Reach back as far as you can, and then you're going to extend forward, and you might be arching your back slightly on the backswing, but when you come up, you want to be exhaling and driving your ribs down towards your belly button, and then basically allow whatever momentum's there to allow your arms to drift up however far they're going to drift. As I said before, if your arms are able to come way up like this, you're not using enough weight, because your butt muscles are the biggest muscle in your body, and they're way stronger than your shoulder muscles up here, or they should be. And so if you're able to lift more with your shoulders than you are with your butt, you're not lifting enough for this exercise, and you're not doing the exercise correctly. Okay, so that's all good. But now you might be thinking, well, those are all exercises for your glutes to strengthen up your glutes, but you are also saying that some of the reasons why a muscle might be tight is that it's also weak, and so we want to strengthen it. So what are the exercises we can do to strengthen up the hip flexors? Well, what you could do is do a bunch of sit-ups, because the sit-ups actually exercise your hip flexors pretty good, in addition to doing the abdominals. They're not actually as effective as an abdominal exercise as they are a hip flexor exercise. But I know you didn't watch this video just to see something like that. So what we could do is also work on our flexibility while at the same time working to strengthen our hip flexors. But before we do that, I'm going to show you a simple standing exercise you can do. And I don't actually have a resistance band, but you've probably seen them before, where you have a looped resistance band of relatively light material, and you put that around the sole of one foot under the arch, and then you stand with the other one, and then you just raise your foot up like that. And it's going to help you to strengthen up your hip flexor. You bring it up, hold it there for a second, let it back down, repeat for the prescribed number of reps, usually 10 to 15 on each side, and there you go, you have that. Now what if you don't have the resistance band though? Can you still do some good hip flexor strengthening exercises in a time-efficient manner? Yes, you can. All right, so the first exercise I like to do, and this is actually a good abdominal exercise as well, and it's just a simple, basic, introductory level gymnastics exercise, is where you put the palms of your hands even with your hip joint here. And if you stand up and you rotate your leg back and forth, you can feel that bone moving, and that's where you want to put the heels of your hands. So from there, you're going to lift your butt off the ground and then point your toes. Just like that. It's going to help you to not only strengthen up your hip flexors, also the quadriceps and your abdominals as well. And so, again, this is another thing that I talk about a lot on my channel, is trying to figure out how you can strengthen particular muscles, but in correlation with a bunch of other muscles, and that makes it a little bit more of a functional exercise, because in real life, most of the stuff that you're doing in concert with other muscles, not just in isolation. This is not to say that isolation exercises are not functional, but if that's all you're doing, it definitely is not functional. So this next exercise is actually one I learned, and it's quite difficult, but to help you actually improve your range of motion for doing a side splits. So what you're going to do again is point your toes, and then you place one hand on each side of your thighs. So we're going to start off with the right leg here, and you're going to take that deep breath in, and then lift, and try to just lift your leg up over like there's like a soup can or something on the ground, and then move it back over. And then go to the other side, lift. As you can see, I don't do this very often, and it's quite difficult, especially when those hip flexors are not the strongest. Lift, come back, other side, lift, just like that. Now, after you've done that, now is a great time to actually stretch out those hip flexors. Oftentimes after I do the side splits, because I'm stretching out the inner thighs, I like to sit, cross-legged like this, because then it helps to stretch out the backside, which was kind of contracted. But the thing that you want to do after you do that is more of a 90-90 stretch, which is going to be like this. Reason it's 90-90, 90 degrees in the ankles, 90 degrees in the knees, 90 degrees in the hips, and so on. From there, deep breath in, keep the chest up. And then this is the part where you're stretching out quadriceps, hip flexors. Lay back like that. Get a good stretch. And when you do the lean forward, you're stretching your glutes on the bottom side of the leg here. So flipping over and repeat on the other side. Deep breath in. It's very important to keep that chest up. Try to keep your back as flat as possible. And don't worry about how far down you're going. Go as far as you can without compromising your back. So for these movements, I recommend anywhere between 10 to 20 seconds in the position. And since you're going to want to be breathing deeply as you're doing this, sometimes instead of counting, I like to count the number of breaths I do. So anywhere between 3 to 5 deep breaths all the way in, all the way out is enough time for you to know how long you should stay in that particular position. Okay guys, that concludes the video. Hopefully you found it informative and to give you a little bit more insight on how you can fix those tight hip flexors for good, and also improve your overall mobility and athleticism. Remember, the body is one interconnected chain. What happens in one part of the body is going to affect what happens in other parts of the body, and as such, you should approach your training in a more holistic manner. If you want, a more, let's say, lean midsection, you want to have a six-pack or whatever, you don't want to spend all your time just doing crunches and sit-ups and leg raises and all that kind of stuff. Because while that might help you to build up your muscles there, it's not going to do anything for the rest of the body, and it's also going to not increase your overall metabolic rate and your overall metabolic activity. The more muscles that you can be incorporating into your workouts, along with a calorie deficit, a high protein diet and a calorie deficit, is what's going to lead to getting that leaner physique that you're looking for, rather than doing isolated exercises for particular parts of the body. Same thing goes for if you want bigger arms. Instead of just doing biceps curls, you want to be doing things like chin-ups, barbell rows, deadlifts, things that work all the musculature and that work multiple muscles at once. And then if you have energy and time left over, go and do those biceps curls to really, concentrate on those individual muscles. But if you are short on time, you want to be doing the exercises that are going to use the most amount of muscle at one time, which are typically your compound movements. This includes things like squats, deadlifts, bench presses, overhead presses, barbell rows, pull-ups, and the like. And those things are going to be doing the best for you. So if you enjoyed the content in this video and would like to see more content related to workout design, how to, work around injuries should you sustain them and also prevent getting them in the first place, diet as far as how to build muscle, lose body fat, and increase athletic performance, then consider subscribing to the channel by hitting the button in the lower right hand corner of the screen. We'll see you all next time for more health and fitness related information. Thanks guys for watching.